When I was a kid, I used to go with my parents to a nearby laundromat at the Dominion Hill Shopping Center on Wilson Boulevard. It's about a mile inside from the Falls Church border. And it's across the street from the Dominion Hill swimming pool and from what's now the skate park that's under renovation. Anyway, I distinctly remember in the 70s that there was a swastika painted into a space in the parking lot. It was about 6 inches on each side, and this was my introduction to an unseemly chapter in Arlington's history, which is what we're going to get into tonight. For those who attended a previous meeting, you know that swastika was painted there to remember Lincoln Rockwell, who was the president of the American Nazi Party, and the spot is where he met his demise. Charlie Clark is our local historian and Falls Church News Press columnist. He's back tonight to provide more details. The Arlington Nazi Party was headquartered here in Arlington from the 1950s to the 1980s. I know most of us know something about that ugly chapter, but I think we'd also all defer to Charlie for his command in this topic. Tonight, Charlie will expand on his previous remarks and show how far those roots grew and spread. Ladies and gentlemen, Charlie Clark.
Good evening. So, in August of 2017, 2 weeks after the violence in Charlottesville, I was at the Dominion Hill Shopping Center. I had anticipated that, I had anticipated that on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of George Lincoln Rockwell, that there might be some action at the shopping center. And as it happened, an NBC News crew had asked me to Sherpa them around Arlington to show them where the 5 houses that were occupied by American Nazi Party members from 1958 to 1983. So I had visited the merchants on the shopping center a couple days earlier, particularly the Tom's Barber Shop, which is still there, which figured in the assassination. And so we were out on the road at about 12, and we were in the middle of an interview with the owner of Mario's Pizza, which also played a role in the Nazi drama, when we got this phone call on my cell saying that they're here. So we scrambled back there, and these are the guys that we saw. The picture was taken by a customer at the barber shop, and it was quickly uploaded. We published it in the Falls Church News Press, but it was a local NBC news station. And these guys, some of my friends later said, why don't you try and identify them, see if you can get them in trouble with their bosses, whatever, but that's really not my role. So George Lincoln Rockwell, who was he, why was he here, and how did the Arlington community react to him? That's what I hope to talk about. So Rockwell, he was born in Bloomington, Illinois, to parents who were vaudeville entertainers. It's a very odd story. His father never really got over the fact that his son became a chief American Nazi, and he grew up meeting all sorts of entertainment personalities like Fred Allen and Fanny Brice. He served in World War II as a naval aviator, and he went to Brown University. He went to a prep school in Maine and then Brown University, and he went for a while to the Pratt Art School in Brooklyn, and he served again in the Korean War as a naval aviator. And at some point during his time in the Navy, he met and married an Icelandic woman, and they read Hitler's Mein Kampf, and they got converted, and they had their honeymoon in Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, which is Hitler's retreat. And he came back to the States, and he chose to form the American Nazi Party in 1958. And he got a few financial backers, a scion in Baltimore named Harold Aerosmith, who rented him a home on Williamsburg Boulevard in Arlington. And they set up a printing press, and they started to manufacture hate literature against blacks and Jews. Why did he choose Virginia, Arlington? Well, I think it was because it's close to Washington, D.C., where there could be a lot of publicity, sophisticated media coverage. But the Virginia political climate was a little bit more receptive, I think, because there were pro-segregationists there in Virginia, and Rockwell actually ran for governor of Virginia. He got 5,000 votes in 19. So they proceeded to make a regular habit of protesting at movie theaters that showed the movie Exodus, or in front of the White House, or in this case, this is in front of Mario's Pizza. Mario's was owned by the Howard Levine family. They were my neighbors in Arlington, and they were Jewish, and the Nazis couldn't handle that. So this is one of the most famous pictures of Rockwell. This house is 928 North Randolph Street in Ballston, and it's that sign was there throughout my childhood. I remember driving by it many times and was always a little puzzled by it. It became a kind of a blight on the community. I'll get to that in the reaction of the community in a minute. There's Rockwell inside the house. Some of these pictures were taken by a gentleman named Jack Hiller, who he and I got together in recent years, and he shared some of his unpublished photos that we published for the first time. Here's the Nazi crew inside that home at 928 North Randolph. Unprepossessing people, I would say. An example of their confrontation, this is the famous sit-in at the Cherrydale Drug Fair, where there's now a commemorative plaque that was installed last June when I was there. And there's Rockwell confronting this African-American protester named Dion Diamond, who is still around. I talk to him now and again. And I tried at one point to identify those guys in the background, wondering whether, what high school they went to and who they were. I think most of them were out-of-towners or in the Nazi Party. But just remember that Rockwell was a very charismatic speaker, and he got gigs going to campuses to speak, and he really liked to shock people. And that was, I think, sort of the key to his psychology. So then you have, this is another protest, Interior Secretary Stuart Udall during the Kennedy administration wanted to integrate the Washington Redskins football team, which was the last holdout NFL team that didn't have a black player under the owner, George Preston Marshall. And one of the reasons is that the Redskins were the only team in the American South, really, and so a lot of the fans in places like North Carolina and Georgia identify with the Redskins, and George Preston Marshall just wasn't going to have it. So this is the Nazis, of course, took George Preston Marshall's side of that. Bobby Mitchell, right, was the first player to integrate the Redskins. So then Rockwell met his demise. He'd become world famous by then. August 25th, 1967, as Tamon said, at the Dominion Hill Shopping Center. And 10 years after that was when some of his followers returned to commemorate the assassination, and they're the ones who drew the stenciled swastika that he recalls. And the Nazis, after he was killed, they never really had a charismatic leader who could match him, but they moved, their barracks when he was killed was across the street at what is now the Upton Hill Park. And they moved over to Clarendon Courthouse area in the building that is now the Java Shack. Very fine coffee house. No relation to the Nazis, but. And they proceeded to try and gain continued respectability. They tried to have a white pride celebration day at Yorktown High School, and the in 1971 beginning, and the school board had to decide whether to permit that, and the ACLU, as they often did, took Rockwell's side. They took his side also in the famous burial fiasco. Rockwell, being a military veteran, had rights to be buried in a national cemetery, so they tried to bury him out in Culpeper, and it got to be such a fiasco. There was violence and rioting, so they canceled that plan. The Nazis in 1976 got a permit, and marched in the Arlington's bicentennial parade. So that's another example of the conflicts over respectability. So who resisted the Nazis? That's really what I was hoping to talk about. You had a group of clergy people, Arlington kind of liberal activists, and Jewish people, many of whom had relatives who had perished in the Holocaust. A lot of the people in Arlington were veterans of World War II who had fought against the Nazis. So you can imagine this, how shocking it was just 13, 15 years after the war for them to be confronting this spectacle. And so they had meetings and tried to monitor the Nazis. They lobbied the state legislature. They finally got a resolution condemning him as an enemy. And there was William J. Hasson was the Commonwealth's attorney at the time, and he conducted a house raid of the Nazi house on Williamsburg Boulevard and confiscated some weaponry. It wasn't that much weaponry compared with today's standards, but it was an issue. And then you had the press. The press, the Nazis were publicity hounds. That's another thing you got to remember. So a lot of their protests and picket lines were designed for publicity. So the newspapers like the Washington Star and the Daily News and the Washington Post and the Northern Virginia Sun eventually got tired of covering every activity they did. And one of the exceptions was Herman Obermeyer, who was the editor and publisher of the Northern Virginia Sun. And I got to work with him in the later years before he died about 2 years ago. And we talked a lot about it. He personally corresponded a lot with Rockwell, and he was Jewish himself and had attended the Nuremberg trials back in 1945 when he was in the Army. So he had a very personal stake in it, and he always thought they needed more monitoring and that they should try. He had a theory that they had violated laws. Somebody had an illegitimate child who may have died in their house, and should that be investigated? The Nazis did get nailed for lacking business licenses for their printing business, which is how they earned money. And the IRS eventually confiscated this house that I showed you on Randolph Street for in a failure to pay taxes. So that was the way they could get them. But I think you just have to remember that there still is a First Amendment, and there's limits to what can be cracked down on. And this issue remains. A lot of people in this area even are surprised to learn that the Nazis had such a presence here. But during the 2016 election, the Java Shack owner, and I got to know him, and he told me all this, they got lots of angry calls and emails from this totally false rumor that they were a headquarters of the Nazis in the year 2016. So over the years, I've done a fair amount of reconstructing of this story using clippings and books and interviewing with people. There's a lot of people in Arlington who remember encounters with the Nazis, seeing them at the public library and all that. And maybe when we get a chance at the Q&A, people can share some of those stories. But that's what I have. Thank you.
Just 1 second, please. Okay, good. By the way, just to add on what Charlie said about the Redskins, I'm pretty sure that the National Football League had its first black player in 1948 or 9 with the Los Angeles Rams. The next to last team integrated in 1952, and the last team integrated, the Redskins, in 1962. So it took 3 to 4 years from the first team to the next to last team, and 10 years from the next to last team to the last team. So much of what Charlie spoke of, what spawned decades ago, just a few miles from here, reemerged in Charlottesville just 18 months ago. Like other movements, it evolved and seeped into our society, for some individuals, very deeply. To provide a perspective on the social dynamics and implications, we are honored to have Dr. Amaka Okechukwu, sociology professor at George Mason University. Her research questions are: how do social movements emerge in relationship to changing ideas and practices in racial justice? And how do identities like race, class, and gender function in the development of social movement collective identity and strategy? Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Amaka Okechukwu.
Okay. That's okay. Yeah, it's fine. Hello, everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Amaka Okechukwu. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at George Mason, where I study racial politics, social movements, and urban place. And my forthcoming book, To Fulfill These Rights, Political Struggle Over Affirmative Action and Open Admissions, comes out in August on Columbia University Press. So today, Charlie has offered a historical insight on the origins of the Ku Klux Klan in Arlington. But in my brief remarks here, I plan to offer a framework for us to think about contemporary manifestations of white supremacy. So I organized these remarks according to three themes. So emergence, or uncovering, anxiety, and denial. Or whose are these, right? Emergence, anxiety, and denial. So first, emergence. So one of the most significant ways that the civil rights movement shaped American culture was that it made de jure racism unfashionable, right? Anti-discrimination laws were passed and enforced, and later many rolled back and divorced of enforcement mechanisms. However, culturally, racial tolerance and later diversity became the default path of civil society. I think many Americans assumed that the civil rights movement and subsequent cultural transformations successfully changed the hearts and minds of white people in particular, and it did for many. But rather than an erasure of outright white supremacy, instead it came indoors, right? In private residences and social clubs, in the all-white private schools that emerged in the midst of federally mandated desegregation, in churches, in militia groups. It still resided in many communities. The civil rights movement did not erase outright white supremacy. Dialectics teaches us that it adapted and went underground, in a sense, right? The internet facilitated connection amongst those who were underground, those who kept their beliefs to themselves in their workplaces or at the grocery store or wherever. The internet, in addition to Fox News in particular in the 90s, served as a space to vent, right? A place to promote new kinds of pseudo-political education and indoctrination, a place to make sense of growing personal, social, and economic insecurity and alienation. Here, there were like-minded people. Here, there was a narrative that gave voice to what they felt had been silenced. Here, they cling to esteem, to pride. While a variety of formal and informal political formations have both come out of these digital spaces and have exploited these digital communities for their own personal gain, these digital spaces are important for understanding the very public manifestation of what we see today. We can no longer take for granted that outright white supremacy does not exist or that it solely comes from fringe groups. It has always been here, but it was covered, it was hidden, and the visible elements dismissed. So 2, anxiety. In this country, foundational to racism has been class anxiety, right? As a sociologist, I understand, and as sociologists as a whole, we understand that the concept of race is not rooted in biological fact, but instead is a social construction developed to signify power and maintain hierarchical social relations. At its core, it's the relationship of power, And this has shaped the historical development of this country as well as the current social reality. As the canonical author Toni Morrison says, quote, "The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being." End quote. Racism also does an incredibly effective job at distracting the white poor and the white working class from recognizing their shared class interest with non-whites. In W.E.B. Du Bois's understudied tome, Black Reconstruction in America, written in 1935 about the Reconstruction period, he says the following about white laborers, quote, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they received a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent upon their votes, treated them with such leniency as to encourage lawlessness. The result of this was that the wages of both classes, meaning the white poor and the black poor, the wages of both classes could be kept low. The whites fearing to be supplanted by Negro labor, the Negroes always being threatened by the substitution of white labor," end quote. If whites had always been compensated with a psychological wage, even as their economic wage fluctuated, what might it mean for their psychological wage to be threatened, to be lowered, to be called unfair, to be held up as unfashionable or dated, while their economic wage also decreased, while they lost an economic wage? Pining for an old way of life, a decent living, with little to no economic prospects, and clinging to the psychological wage that elites of all colors told them was wrong. I don't say this as a means of sympathizing, because at the same time that they're losing ground economically, so were black people and so were other ethnic groups. But I mention this as a framework for understanding. So they see northern elites doing nothing, right, to challenge growing economic inequality in this country, and in fact are facilitating it. These folks use race as a frame to understand the declining quality of life. This anger, this frustration in regards to this declining quality of life, a dominant culture's rejection of their beliefs and way of life, they are only further incensed when these elites are sometimes non-white, such as in the election of Barack Obama. It signals to them that everyone's way of life is improving except theirs, right? This is how they understand it. When elites such as Trump pander to them, they see it as an opportunity to be heard, to be visible, to come from behind laptops and figuratively out of the closet, a chance at a psychological wage and maybe even an economic one. They are seen. It matters less that these political decisions made in their honor guarantee the destruction of this planet and the breakdown of society. No, nostalgia is comfortable. It affords them a kind of dignity, and this is dangerous and destructive, and this is social reality. So 3, denial. When events like Charlottesville or Charleston or Tree of Life occur, there is an immediate effort to pin the horrific violent crimes on a lone gunman or a fringe group. There is an immediate denial that these violent people have anything to do with America, which is why so often we think foreign terrorists rather than domestic terrorists, right? That this is an aberration. When there are no deaths directly involved in public parades of white supremacy, people say, those people aren't from here. They're not from this community, right? This was said in Charlottesville. They are outsiders. As Southerners said after the Civil War to Northern interlopers, right? They're carpetbaggers. They don't represent us. They aren't us, right? But are they? While the post-civil rights period may have made outright white supremacy unfashionable, politicians and everyday white folk in particular were fine with the dog whistles, with the coded appeals, states' rights, force busing, welfare queens, so-called colorblindness, right? They were fine with the angry white men of 1995, right, led by Newt Gingrich. They were fine with claims of reverse racism as political appeals. But perhaps every day white folk forgot about the growth of the radical right in response to Ruby Ridge, right, in 1992, or white supremacist Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols in the Oklahoma City bombing. The Southern Poverty Law Center chronicles that hate groups have been consistently rising in this country since 1999, with a 22% increase in neo-Nazi groups in the year 2017. Consistent growth doesn't point to a singular event, right, or a singular factor or origin. While Trump's campaign and election has energized hate groups, these groups were already on the rise. For me, it makes the tacit acceptance and the normalization of Trump's reign as very troubling, right, sickening. But perhaps more importantly, it raises the fact that whether Trump is able to stay in office or not, this type of expression of white supremacy is not going back into the figurative closet, no matter who is president. However, as I close, it is perhaps even more important to consider institutionalized racism as a central prong of white supremacy. While de jure racism may be illegal and unfashionable, de facto racism is perfectly acceptable in this country. That our political and economic structures still produce rampant racial inequality, and this being the status quo, is perhaps a bigger threat to the social fabric of this country. As Dr. King expressed in his letter from a Birmingham jail, quote, "I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, 'I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action,' who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection," end quote. This negative piece that King speaks of is in operation when we think about the poisoning of Flint's water, the weaponizing of black skin of unarmed citizens by police, school tracking, that medical doctors regularly believe and practice that black people have a higher pain tolerance, that migrant children are dying in detention camps, mass incarceration, and more. That institutionalized racism persists alongside these public, explicit pronouncements of racism are both central to white supremacy, right? And that is the full story. White nationalist organizations are only part of the story. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Please indulge me for a moment. I want to get this projector off. Oh. Okay, well, what I'd like to do at this point is to have the speakers come up for a Q&A, but I'm going to have them stand over on this side without a projector in their face, shining in their faces, and we'll give them the handheld microphones. Also, can I get Lynn and who else can I? Okay. And it's time for our famous Q&A. Oh, Now, normally, this is where I get to say the Arlington Committee of 100 adage, please ask your question in the form of a question. But this time, with Charlie here, if you have a story to relate, feel free to do so, but please do so briefly, okay? So with that, we have our microphone people in place. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. If you can, stand up, announce yourself, and ask your question or give your brief story. Who's first?
My question is what happened to the Nazi Party before 1958 when it was reconstructed under this guy? Because my dad encountered Nazis in the 1930s in Milwaukee. So we had a vibrant American Nazi Party in the 30s. What happened to that?
Yeah, there was American Nazi sympathizers in the 30s.
Thanks, Kim.
Just tabled your question. So. But Rockwell formed what he called the American Nazi Party in 1958. The name would change 4 or 5 years later. That was one of the fights he had with the guy who eventually killed him, John Patler. They renamed it the National Socialist White People's Party, but they chartered it in 1958. So, yeah.
Next question. Lynn, there's one right to your left.
All right.
I want to bring this up today. I'm Kathy Scruggs, and the whole point about racism and segregation and where is the positive peace that Martin Luther King talked about, all we have to do is look at our public schools and we realize that there's quite a bit of segregation that's going on. And we could say, well, it's just housing patterns. Okay, but why are those housing patterns what they are? And that all of that really was de jure, and it is because of zoning that we don't have multi-unit housing in large swaths of Arlington because it's reserved for single-family homes. So, do you have a solution for this? What can we do?
Yes, so unfortunately, I don't have marching orders for everyone in this room, just in regards to solutions. You know, in regards to, de jure where there's de facto, I mean, when it comes to the housing patterns, I don't have a great working knowledge of Arlington, but we know about the histories of redlining, of blockbusting, of racially restrictive covenants. There's lots of reasons as to why our neighborhoods look the way that they look today that are not about just preferences of wanting to live here, right? They're historically developed in a particular way as it relates to racism and how that was mapped onto place in particular ways. But, our schools are clearly a sore spot in most places in the United States, still very racially segregated. And as a result, there are huge resource chasms, right, that exist among different kinds of schools. But yeah, I unfortunately don't have a solution for that. I think that's something that a variety of people should get together and collectively talk about. There's lots of think tanks and people that work on education daily that are thinking about these issues and how to sort of solve these problems. And I'm unfortunately not one of them, so.
Okay, next.
So I'm Mary Hines. it's so timely to have you here today, both of you. I can't think of a time in my life when this has been on my mind as much as it is with all that's going on in Virginia. And I've lived here for 40 years, not as long as Charlie, but a long time, and had a lot of different experiences, as I'm sure everybody in this room has, in black-white relationships or lack thereof. So I guess, well, I'm not looking for solution. I'm looking for clues, and I'm looking for clues from both of you about ways in which communities can engage around understanding what institutional racism really is, and then understanding how it plays in the place that we live. Arlington is a place where there's tons of transplants, and there's lots of people coming, ongoing, all the time. So how do we create a narrative that helps us move forward as a community? I guess that's really what my question is.
That's a great question. Well, I guess one approach could, I don't know if this organization ever partners with other organizations, but that may be a way. I don't know if there's an NAACP or an organization that works around racism and issues, around race, and particularly resources in Northern Virginia. That may be an opportunity to partner and intentionally have a conversation with people who are thinking about these things as a sort of first step, perhaps in having this conversation and figuring out how to address it as it manifests here in Northern Virginia. So that could be a first step, partnering with another organization and having a very intentional conversation about it.
There's a couple of reformed white nationalists who've written books and been interviewed on 60 Minutes and things like that. Their name escapes me right now, but that's, I think, is a good clue. There's definitely a psychological aspect to it, and there's, in my non-scholarly view, there are gradations of racism and stereotyping and fear of the other to more active hatred and hostility and violence. And the Nazis seem to be willing to express the racism in the most venomous, literal form, that the kind of attitudes that for a lot of other people, it's just sort of a passing thought. They sort of are tempted maybe, but they would never go that far. And I think that's why the Nazis were so shocking, is that they came out and said what was sort of expressing some of the secret thoughts of other people.
Okay, next question in the back.
Thank you for your time. So with the re-emboldening of these fringe groups, they came from either one or two places, in my opinion. Either they were raised to it or they were drawn to it. With what we're seeing in the last couple of years, what's more likely the story? That they were strong but in the darkness this whole time? Or we found younger white men who somehow felt marginalized for some reason, saw them being emboldened and drawn to it, whether it be because these guys were more charismatic or they had no other resources?
I think it's both. I don't know if, I wonder the import of the distinction. But I do think that there have been a growing number of people that are attracted to, sort of neo-Nazi, white supremacist organizations, as mentioned, as it relates to economic precarity, social alienation, feeling socially alienated, again, the sort of declining wage, feeling like, they're losing power, they're losing ground in a world that's changing. And I think that the internet has been a very powerful resource for them in finding other people's in order to continue to sustain that activity. Now, like as mentioned, people aren't just meeting in chat rooms, they can meet in person now because Trump has allowed folks to come out of the closet and take up space and be public and be visible. And so I do think that it has to do with social and social alienation, feeling socially alienated, economic precarity, and feeling like they're losing ground. But I do think that I think it's wrong for us to think that, racists just disappeared. Like after this, I think that's very incorrect for
Make your computer easy. Cancel.
to believe that, because they didn't, and so some people have, whether they've been sort of raised with the hoods, I don't know if that's what it is, but they may have been raised in a household or in a family or in a community where it was okay to believe that. I also think that people who are angry and attracted to violence, if you're searching the internet looking for how to blow up things and that kind of thing, you're gonna come across the Nazi literature and the white supremacist stuff. So like the Columbine shooters, right? I don't think that they were actively white supremacists, but you found their literature and their sort of influences and some of the things that they were reading and writing and talking about because they were attracted to violence. So yeah, I mean, there's so many different factors at work here, so that's how I would begin to answer that question.
Well, I just remember a song from the early 70s. The lyric went, "Everybody's got to have somebody to look down on." And I see that kind of pattern playing out in a lot of these clashes.
Okay, the man with the microphone.
Today, well, I'm a white guy, and today I was talking to another white guy, and I said, "Well, you going tonight?" And they said, "No, I've thought about that enough." And I let it go, and I walked away, and I says, and when you were talking, Professor, I thought that I'm one of these middle-class, dangerous guys. Now, what could I have done? I don't know. That sounds like a stupid question, but.
I mean, you can engage people. You can ask them when you have that fleeting thought of, well, I don't, what could that mean? It's fine to ask it and to challenge people. It doesn't always necessarily mean conflict. Confrontation isn't always conflict. It's just, asking someone to clarify and really engaging with them, particularly if it's people that you know and you have a relationship with. They're going to be more willing to listen to you than if I find this white guy and come up to him and ask him the question, right? It is often through personal relationships that we have with people that people can be transformed, right? So you work on the people around you.
Okay, next question.
Okay. I was living here when George Lincoln Rockwell was assassinated. I don't remember it. I don't. Why was he, who was the assassin,
Sure.
and what was his reason?
Yeah, I'm happy to go into all that. I only had 10 minutes, so. One of his followers was a Greek named John Patsopoulos, and he changed his name to Patler so it would sound like Hitler. And he was he ran a printing business, a graphic artist, and he and Rockwell was kind of his idol for a while, and then they had a falling out, and there was rumors that some of the attorneys who worked on the case thought this was evidence that was not admissible, with it. Rockwell had an affair with his wife. It's a possibility. But so he obtained this German Mauser gun from his father-in-law and stood up on the roof of the Dominion Hill Shopping Center and killed him, and then ran dramatic chase through the 4-mile run and Bon Air Park and all the way over to Harrison Street, where the cops found him at a bus stop with wet pants. He'd been waiting in the 4-mile run where he hid the gun. And Commonwealth Attorney Hassan asked for the death penalty for him, but he ended up getting like 7 years, and then it was reduced. And he's still living today in New York City. The Post tracked him down a couple years ago, but he wouldn't really give him an interview. So.
Okay, next we have one dead center back.
Hi, I'm John Chun. Charlie, as you mentioned, it's only recently that we dedicated a plaque to the lunch counter sit-in in Cherrydale. It's only recently that we marked formerly 7-foot walls parts of Arlington that separated white and black neighborhoods. So, what else are we missing? What else are we missing that we can educate people in Arlington now and Arlington in the future in regards to Arlington's own racial injustice pass, be it in our local education or be it in further physical markings to show that this happened here?
Well, I certainly think having these kinds of discussions helps and may whet people's appetites for learning more of the history. When Catherine raised the issue of housing patterns, there were covenants in Arlington houses in the deeds when these homes were built in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. That some of those covenants still show up. I grew up in Arlington Facebook page. I hear people quoting from them, and they forbade renting to blacks or Jews. And the segregation patterns were still very clear in my living memory in the late 50s and early 60s. And use of the N-word was pretty common among my friends in Arlington in the 60s. So it's not like ancient history. So there's still people around who remember all this, and it's not a very pleasant topic. That's the other issue. You know, your Lynn's friend who didn't want to come tonight. You know, I can understand sometimes it sounds alienating, but once you throw yourself in, it can be very inspiring to confront it, I think.
Okay, over here.
I'm Marjorie Hobart, and in response to Chandra's question, I believe the school board, in its efforts, not always welcome, to rename things in Arlington to no longer honor the Confederacy and be more sensitive to all of our community. I think those efforts are important. The new elementary school near Thomas Jefferson Middle School is named after a very prominent black woman who was an effective advocate for the black community in Arlington, and I believe the Stratford building is being renamed for Ms. Ham, who was a marvelous leader in the black community. So I think those things are baby steps going forward. We do have another elementary school, the Campbell Elementary School. Mr. Campbell was one of the advocates who worked with Thurgood Marshall on Brown versus the Board of Education. We know Elizabeth from her WETA business, but he was a very important part of having de jure school segregation set aside.
Very good. Alice Fleet is the name of that new elementary school,
Alice
right?
Fleet and Dorothy Ham?
Yeah.
Okay, over here.
Hi, Mark Habib. I was something you said, Amaka, which I thought was very interesting, was when you made the allusion to the fact that there was a desire that part of what promoted the hatred and the racism was a desire to prevent a class movement from forming. In other words, to prevent. And so I was thinking about that after you mentioned it. There's a really wonderful book about the civil rights movement in Birmingham, which is where I grew up, called "Carry Me Home" by Diane McWhorter. And Birmingham was an industrial city. It's a Rust Belt city. It's not a typical Southern city. And one of the things she uncovered is that some of the owners of the steel mills and the factories there, while these were white people who were, country club white people, they'd never be caught dead with a Klansman or that class of white person. They secretly funded the Klan movement because it was in their interest to keep working class blacks and working class whites separated. And that phenomenon, I think, continues, and it may not be driven by capitalist interests anymore. But if you think of, Trump's entire political career is based on fomenting division. That's what it's based on. So I think part of this reconciliation and talking dialogue, part of that process is understanding that, yes, we all know who the kind of outlier crazy, the white nationalists, the extremists are and all that, but there are other forces out there that don't want this to happen. And it's in their political interest or their business interest or whatever to prevent this. So I just thought I'd throw that out because you alluded to that. A lot of people don't talk about that. A lot of people don't talk about how I mean, in the academic community they do, but in the common dialogue, they don't mention that that was a very important part of the whole racist narrative, was making sure that a working class movement did not arise.
Right. No, I agree with you. The book that I mentioned that I suggest everyone read, even though it's very long and dense, is Black Reconstruction in America. It's by W.E.B. Du Bois. Most know him, through his activism with the NAACP, but, founding sociologist, I think, American sociologist of the discipline. And it talks about this, right, the sort of the ways in which race is used as a way to divide class interests, or divide the working class from banding together to fight for their, a better life. So I highly suggest you read Black Reconstruction in America, and there's lots of texts that can, point to race's role in dividing folks, particularly when it comes to class.
Okay, over here.
Yeah, hi, my name's Frick Curry, and I first of all want to thank you all for having my wife and I here, even though we're from Falls Church. The professor made note of the appalling rise in hate groups, particularly since 1999, and I couldn't help but think when she was saying that, well, during the same time frame, hasn't there been well documented the phenomenon of increasing inequality of income disparity, with the now famous 1% of the population accounting for what, 80-90% of all assets of wealth or income. And I just can't help but wonder if, and of course that disparities become much worse given the Trump tax cuts, which clearly benefit corporations and upper income brackets. And I'm just wondering, to what extent can that rise in hate groups be stemmed if economic insecurity that arises out of the increasing inequality of income, if economic insecurity can be lessened through, for example, going back and taxing the wealthy, and to the extent that they were even during the Eisenhower years, where 70% of upper income brackets were taxed, and that money then redistributed or other measures taken to reduce that income inequality, particularly through making the tax system fair, and maybe even implementing such programs as a minimum guaranteed income, which is now being experimented with in a number of countries. In fact, it was experimented with in this country at one point. In other words, if you reduce that income inequality, don't you begin to do away with some of the real basis of that prejudice, that hatred, and really reduce, if you will, the hate groups and their ability to recruit?
I think addressing this issue of economic inequality is absolutely linked with the rise in hate groups. And I think that addressing that may curtail some of the outright violent, overt manifestations of white supremacy. But I don't think that within itself takes care of racism writ large. We have to deal with, again, this is institutional, right? Our institutions are founded on these racial divisions. Just by passing a policy is not going to rid ourselves of this sort of history and the ways in which this history has shaped different people's relationship to power. So that within itself won't do that. But I do think that we absolutely need to address the growing economic inequality in this country, because it is another way in which, social disorder is emerging out of that. I absolutely do agree with that. But we have to address, again, the institutional roots, and we have to address the psychological wage, as I mentioned, as Du Bois would mention, right? The psychological wage.
I think we've got a question right in the middle of the room.
Can it be sharing something rather than a question, or do you want a question?
We're running short on time, so
Okay.
if you could just make it brief either way.
Okay, I'm Ramona Ferrando. You talked earlier about the schools and how, because of where the houses are located, how the schools are racially maybe kind of lopsided. I just wanted to share that you're right that racism is not dead. We have a granddaughter who goes to one of the Arlington County schools. She is mixed race. She has experienced in this school comments like, choose a color because she's not dark enough and she's not light enough. She's in the middle. Or her hair, sometimes it's like out like this. You know, she has really gorgeous hair, but a beautiful afro sometimes, and sometimes it's in a ponytail. And the thing is that I think the schools maybe need to work harder right now to address this issue that is happening in the schools, including George Washington University.
It was interesting with this, blackface, all that's going on in the state with blackface. I was having a phone conversation with my mother about it, and she was saying that she was reminding me that my brother, he's about to turn 30, right? So when he was in high school, she was saying, well, they were doing that when he was in high school, right? That's not that long ago. This is in the early 2000s probably, right? So again, just, raising these questions about how we often think we're way further along than we actually are. That's my point.
Okay, I think we have at the very back, got a last question.
Hi, my name is Gerda Friedheim, and I don't live here. I mean, I am living here now, but I'm not from here. I'm from Cleveland. I've been very active in the civil rights movement. And I'm just profound. I think your discussions are really terrific. But I just wonder how much impact a president of the United States who says there are good people on both sides in the Charlottesville chaos 2 years ago. I mean, this is beyond my belief. And it's damaging, believe me, because young people get, and many people say, if the president says it, it must be so. That's all. Okay. And it's okay.
He's right behind me.
Okay, on that cheerful note, we'll bring this evening to an end. Because that is all the time we have. I'd like to thank you for your attendance and your attention to this dark chapter in Arlington. I call on us to learn from all the chapters of Arlington's history, right and wrong, and let's do that in the proper proportion. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Charlie Clark and Professor Amaka Okechukwu. It goes without saying that you've given us a lot to think about, and it's been a very enlightening evening for all of us. We hope that you will join us next month for a debate on whether the county board members should be paid full-time. This will be taken up by Libby Garvey and John Weisstadt. You can make your reservations at our website, arlingtoncommittee100.org. I'd also like to thank the program committee for putting tonight's program together. Thank you to Brian Marquin, and thank you to the board members. Thank you to Anita, Marjorie, and Jeannie for working at the front desk, and of course for George Hobart for selling us the drink tickets. Thank you again to the Marymount Special Events team and to Arlington Independent Media's technical crew. As a reminder, you can watch this program on AIM's cable channel and on YouTube via our website. And of course, thank you to all of you for participating this evening. We hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have any thoughts or questions, please see the board members. We're the ones with the ribbons underneath our name tags. And speaking of which, on your way out, please drop off your name tags. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next month.